me get into something for a moment. And I thought about this because it's an idea that occurred to me. You know, there's such a thing as what they call naive realism. But I actually realized the better way to talk about this is what I would call naive interpretation of reality. People have a naive interpretation of things. And you have to think back in the old days. When people used to believe in things like ghosts and goblins and stuff like that, when they used to believe that they would be possessed by something. For example, sometimes people were telling the truth, but it was based on a naive interpretation of things. It's truthful in the sense that people were sincere in what they were saying. Like people would believe that they were possessed by some spirit in the night that would come to them at night and possess them. And so they weren't just making this up or just lying. They were being very honest about it. But it wasn't a spirit. It wasn't. What it was, in many cases, what many of the experts would understand to be true, is that people had sleep paralysis. But, you know, if you had sleep paralysis in the 1800s, 1700s, or even earlier, you wouldn't have interpreted it that way. You would not have had a more advanced interpretation of what happened. Your interpretation would have been that you were being possessed by a ghost or an evil spirit. I mean, some people still do that even in our modern times. People have a naive interpretation of reality. They'll see something and they'll come up to the conclusion that, well, maybe it was aliens from another planet. You know, I was thinking about something that happened in real life some years ago, maybe about more than 30 years ago. Me and two of my brothers, we were looking out the window, just looking out the window for whatever reason. And all of a sudden, we saw this streak of light go across the sky. Very fast. Faster than any airplane could possibly fly. I mean, it just zipped across the sky. Streak of light. And you know, for the longest time, you know, all three of us, we looked at each other like, did you see that? Did you see? You know, we all saw it, so it wasn't a hallucination. We saw it. But you know, for the longest time, I kept thinking, that was a UFO. That was the first thought to go through my mind. That's a UFO. That's a UFO. But then I started to question, was that really a UFO? Was it really? I don't think I really truly believe that was like some alien spaceship that was zipping across the sky. I didn't know what it was. I honestly didn't know what it was. But I didn't come to a supernatural or oddball conclusion, except just out of habit, I would always refer to that as a UFO. Because it was an unidentified flying object that zipped across the sky. And I think later, when I started learning things and learning stuff about how things happen, I began to come to a different interpretation of what that was that I saw. What it probably was a meteor hitting the atmosphere. I mean, after looking at, you know, you see film clips of what a meteor looks like when it actually hits the atmosphere. That's pretty much what it looked like. You see this streak of light, bright light. It was bright for a second. It was just zoom for a few seconds. Went across the sky, zipped across, and it disappeared. More than likely, it was probably a meteor hitting the Earth's atmosphere. Meteors can be very small. They can be as small as, let's say, like smaller than this coin, but yet it could make a very bright light when it hits the atmosphere because it's hitting the Earth's atmosphere. Sometimes at speeds of close to like 500,000 miles an hour. It can actually very high speed. So it produces a tremendous amount of energy and a lot of light. The thing is that, you know, when you don't know something, you interpret things one way. Let me talk about something else too. Something when I was really even younger. I was, you know, back in the days I used to say, back when I was in the single digits, you know, before I was 10. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old. And I remember having to go to the washroom. Sitting down. All of a sudden I looked and there was a huge rat. I mean, a rat about the size of a cat. Huge rat. And I saw it and I got scared and I jumped up. You know, and ran. I was scared. And then, you know, but back then I didn't understand something. Like, how could a rat get to be that big? And then later on, once I began to see things, think about things, interpret things, and realize, and I still had the image of what that rat looked like, I realized that it was an animal, but it wasn't a rat. It was a possum. A possum had actually got into the house. It was sitting up there by the toilet. And that thing probably was more scared of me than I was of it. But I thought it was a rat. You know, a naive interpretation of things. When you're at an earlier stage, you interpret things one way. You know, it's just like, I think about now, you always hear stories, well, not always, but every so often you hear these interesting stories about people who were declared dead and then they came back to life. In which case they really weren't dead. It's just some person misdiagnosed the fact that they were dead. And death is, as I said once before in one of my videos, and it is true, you can think about that, ask a doctor. Death is actually a diagnosis, just like any other disease or something. Doctors have to check, make sure, and they do all kind of different things to make sure that a person is actually dead. Well, sometimes people don't do such a good job, or they missed it. Just like a person could misdiagnose an illness, they could misdiagnose that someone's dead. Send them to the morgue and that person gets up. Person could be in a very deep coma. Well, imagine if this happened 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400. Many times there were these fears, because it did happen, of people being buried alive. You know, especially in situations where people weren't embalmed and there was no autopsy. Once embalming and autopsy happened, you definitely did. But, you know, when someone's just put in a casket, put in the ground, buried, maybe sometimes years later they dig the person up. You know, they're going to move the body from one cemetery to, maybe somebody opens the casket just to see what, you know, what's going on. I mean, obviously, they don't expect somebody to jump out, but they realize when they open up the coffin, sometimes, they realize there was scratching at the top of the coffin. I mean, it's kind of morbid, but it's true, because a person wasn't dead. They buried someone alive. That would happen sometimes. Well, you know, if you go back even further, like I say, 1,000 years ago, when people thought somebody was dead and people had even less technology, you put somebody somewhere and then they come back maybe 2 or 3 days later. They came back. You know, what explanation would you give for that if you didn't have modern technology or modern science to interpret? You know, it was a miracle. They came back from the dead. They were resurrected, etc. I'm just throwing that out as understanding of things. How, when we look at things in the past, people in the past weren't lying. They just sort of had a naive interpretation of things. It's just an interesting thought. It's just something I'm throwing out there just to think about.